In this podcast, we're going to talk about history in the making, really. The fall of the Assad dynasty, which lasted about 54 years from the early 70s when Hafez al-Assad took the throne, took over Syria. And of course, this lasted all the way up until about a week ago, December 8th, 2008, when Bashar al-Assad was overthrown in really an amazing series of events that it only took about approximately about 10 days for the rebels in the north to overrun all the major cities in Syria. So truly amazing times we're living in, and like I said, sort of history in the making. Now, let's take a little bit of a step back and just talk a little bit about Hafez al-Assad, who is, of course, the dictator of Syria, approximately from about 1971 to 2000. His death in 2000 from cancer. And what is sort of amazing is that he was in charge of he was from a minority in Syria called the Alawites, and they came from sort of a mountainous region near the coast of Syria on the western side. And and that's what's sort of amazing about this, the fact that he would even be able to become a dictator when they're only, I think like 75% of the country is Sunni, and he's not Sunni. The Alawites are sort of a sect of the Shiites. So it was really, truly amazing. But he was sort of the last man standing. There were several, Syria overthrew their the royal family, I believe, in the late 50s. That's when that happened. And after that, there was, a lot of coups, several coups d'etats and stuff happening. And so he sort of was the last man standing, and he was able to establish absolute rule. He was clever, though. He was very adept politically. He knew that he couldn't rule the country without including the Sunnis. So he did that. In fact, when 1983, he had some health issues, he created a ruling commission. I think it was of six generals, and they were all Sunnis. And that actually almost started a coup from his brother, who didn't like that, the fact that he would have six Sunnis. But that shows you that he not only was he inclusive, he probably didn't trust his brother, because his brother was not put in charge of this commission. And the coup failed, and his brother was exiled. And he actually only recently came back a couple of years ago. Bad timing for him. Real bad timing. But yeah, so that was what happened in 1983. Now, one thing that was interesting was his oldest son, Basil al-Assad, was the chosen heir. And actually that health scare in 1983 caused Hafez to start to think twice about, he started to look at his own mortality and began to groom his son, Basil, to become the heir apparent, to become the heir. He would become the next dictator after Hafez died. And so he appeared in a lot of public appearances. He was in the military. He was popular. As far as we know, he was pretty popular, and given by, well, we'll talk about this in a minute, but his funeral. But in any event, yeah, he was supposed to be the rule. Now, Bashar al-Assad, who would, of course, become the dictator and who was just overthrown about a week ago, at this time, he really didn't care about the having any sort of political involvement in Syria. He sort of shunned it. And, we see in the past these sort of sibling rivalries for the throne, but Bashar al-Assad was more than content to sort of live in the background and reap some of the benefits of being associated with the Assad dynasty, but didn't necessarily really care about being the next dictator or even competing with his older brother, who apparently, from what we know, some tidbits that we have received from this, and there weren't a lot coming out of Syria. It was a very repressive society, and there wasn't a lot of foreign media that were allowed in there. But what we do know is that his brother picked on him, and he was just very different than his father and his brother. He was sort of timid, sort of this scrawny teenager, non-military type, just not the type that you would think that would eventually take over Syria. So everything was in place for Bashar to sort of take over until 1994. And his brother, I believe he was in a Ferrari, was driving to the airport and was either late for the airport. I don't know the exact story, but he was driving 150 miles an hour in the early morning, which is never a good idea. Lost control of the car. He's not a race car driver. And that was it. The future heir was dead. And so Bashar at this time is in London and pursuing a career. He wanted to become an eye doctor. Interesting choice, an eye doctor. Interesting choice. And was apparently doing pretty well at it. He was excelling in his studies, and it's interesting that he went to London. I think that was his attempt to sort of get away from his role in Syria. And he didn't want to be part of, like, he just really didn't want to be associated with politics there. And so this was sort of his way of forging his own identity. So he gets a call from his father, and his father says, guess what? You're now the heir. You got to come back to Syria. And Bashar kind of reluctantly agreed. And in his first couple meetings with his father, he basically said, no, I don't want to do this, but was quickly talked out of it. And so the first public appearance we see of Bashar is at Bassal's funeral, where he actually speaks from sort of, I remember he's sort of looking down at these notes, and he looked very uncomfortable. Look, that was the take I had. He looked extremely uncomfortable, like he didn't want to be there. You could tell this just wasn't his cup of tea. But his father needed an heir at this point. He didn't want his whole dynasty to fall apart that he had worked so hard to establish over 3 decades of ironclad rule. He wanted this the dynasty to continue. And so he began to quickly put on a fast track, began to quickly put Bashar on a path towards that. And he went to boot camp at the military. They wanted to make him look like a military guy. He went to all these functions with his father. They sent him to France. France still, of all the Western nations, France had the closest relationship with Syria. Of course, they had been, they had ruled Syria for a long time until they were kicked out, but they were still close to Syria, and they maintained close ties with Hafez. So he sent them there. I believe it was Jacques Chirac who received them. And this was all in an effort to make Bashar look like he's the next ruler. Now, this is an interesting tidbit, though. Very interesting. I find this interesting. Is there was no official announcement that he was the heir. And they had to be careful because he was sort of the public of Syria. They didn't know who he was. They barely knew who he was even. It had been Bashar who had been the one who had been on all the TV shows and cameras and all the events. They didn't know who this guy was. Who's this guy? He sort of was just there, but they didn't really know who he was. So now Hafez had to be a little bit careful. So there was no formal announcement that he was the heir, but I guess I would put it this way. It was clearly understood that he would be the heir. That's how it was understood. And it was the sort of propaganda that they began to spin, and now we know that this was some pretty big-time propaganda, was that he would be the reformer. That's the big message that the Syrian government and media were spinning, that he's going to be that reformer. Everything's going to change. We're not going to be as repressive. It's going to be an open society. And this was all in an effort, A, to get Bashar accepted by the foreign, the foreign entities, foreign nations, but also the people of Syria. So really, it was a two-pronged strategy. So when Bashar finally took over in 2000, Hafez died and Bashar took over. He takes over, and he has this very glamorous wife that he's just recently married, Asma al-Assad, and she was born and raised in London to Syrian exiles who had a lot of ties to Syria. So she was Syrian, but she was born in London and spoke perfect English. She was very glamorous and sort of fit this image that Bashar was looking for, that he's this sort of modern reformer. So he's got this very glamorous, modern-looking Arab wife, and things are looking good, right? People are starting to sort of drink the Kool-Aid and say, hey, maybe there will be some change in Syria. And of course, he has this very fit look. He's in business attire most of the time. We don't see him a lot, at least early on, we don't see him in military fatigues. Eventually we do when he grows into his role as dictator. But early on, we see him sort of in this business suit. He's traveling to meet Jacques Chirac, becomes really good friends with him. He's good in interviews, by the way. Surprisingly, he's open, whereas Hafez was very closed. He's very good in interviews, especially with Western journalists. They'll ask him some tough questions, and he'll answer them and even laugh at them. So he sort of presents this image that he's not really this repressive dictator that his father was. So he's sort of changing the look of Syrian politics. So, and he even allows, for the very first time in many decades, he allows freedom of speech. There are actually newspapers that come about that are allowed to say basically what they want. I mean, this is almost unheard of in Syria, any sort of alternate voice. And the intelligence apparatus around Assad, and that's the way it always is with dictatorships. They always have a large intelligence apparatus that surround and protect them. They are involved in all of the departments, or in these cases, ministries. They have their hands in on every facet of the government. So they're very powerful and very reliant on Bashar al-Assad. Now, I will back up a little bit. They had an initial meeting, I should say, an initial meeting of the Ba'ath Party. They met and they confirmed Bashar al-Assad as the ruler. And I think there had been some dissidents, I should say, that were opposed to Bashar. They felt that he hadn't earned his wings, as they say, and felt somebody else with more political experience should have been confirmed. And Hafez, of course, rejected all of this and made it quite clear that Bashar was going to be the nominee. Now, I think at this time, if they had made a concerted effort, the Ba'ath Party leading elites could have easily got rid of Bashar, purged him, whatever, exiled him, but they didn't. And in the end, and I'm talking about after Hafez died, they had an opportunity to do that, and they didn't. And I think the reason is that they, I guess what I would say is Bashar was the best candidate of a bad pool of candidates. So they probably thought, hey, we can control this guy and we can keep the gravy train rolling. That's really the key here. Keep that gravy train rolling. We have to remember that with dictatorships and well, with anybody that comes to power, they have done that through building a patronage network. This goes all the way back to ancient Rome, Julius Caesar, all of these Pompey. They're all building vast patronage networks that support them financially, militarily, whatever they need. And that exists even to today. Everybody has a series of people that support them. And usually they all want something in return. And in dictatorships especially, it's usually some financial considerations. And certainly that's what's going on here. These guys are thinking, hey, we can control Bashar and we can keep the gravy train going. We can keep our money-making engines going that we have that are very profitable. So it really wasn't in their best interest at that point to get rid of Bashar. So they make him effectively the dictator and follow Hafez's final wishes. That's what they do. And Bashar gets in, at that meeting of the Ba'ath Party, they televise that nationwide, and he gives a very interesting speech. He talks about reform. And I'm going to allow this. This is what we're going to push. And so they have this, and that happens for the first time. Like I said before, I think they called it the Damascus Spring, and they allow sort of dissenting voices and free speech. And there's these newspapers that basically emerge and start criticizing Bashar, and sort of this intelligence apparatus under Bashar al-Assad is looking at this with a very cautious eye, I should say it that way. and we're very suspicious of it. And eventually, I guess we would call them the opposition at this point, kind of crossed the line and called for Bashar al-Assad to step down and to hold nationwide free elections. And that was sort of the big tipping point in Bashar al-Assad's career. But he did nothing initially. He still did nothing. And so these intelligence chiefs and military chiefs all approached Assad and basically demanded that he allow them to purge these people, to shut down the newspapers, and basically arrest all the perpetrators of this. And al-Assad agrees reluctantly. Okay, and I'm going to have to give up this image that I built up, but okay, it is a necessary evil. And that's what happens. The military and intelligence agencies all arrest all the newspaper editors. Everybody's basically involved with it is arrested, thrown into jail. Who knows what happens to a lot of them. Some of them are given trials like a year later and then thrown into jail, given many decades of hard labor. So the whole thing's shut down. And this is sort of the first big hit on al-Assad's image of a reformer. That was the sort of the first big hit he took. But he survived it, and Jacques Chirac is still friends with him and some of the Western nations. But they're looking at him now a little bit suspiciously, very suspiciously. Now, what happened here was in 2004. Well, let me back up. Syria had occupied Lebanon since 1975. About almost, we're talking a very long time, almost 30 years of occupation. And there was they were starting, though, to get unpopular in Lebanon. Mainly, the main actor involved was a guy named Rafik Hariri, who was the prime minister of Lebanon, and he was starting to turn on the Syrians. They wanted them out of there, basically. They wanted, and I should also say he was really almost best friends with Jacques Chirac, of course, prime minister of France. He was president of France. He was extremely good friends with Jacques Chirac. I should point that out. So much so that they attended a lot of the same parties. They invited each other to their houses. They were just very good friends, long-term friendship. Well, what happened here was that, like I said, the Syrians were, there was a big anti-Syrian opposition in Lebanon that was basically led by Rafik. He was one of the leaders of it. And Bashar al-Assad effectively threatened Rafik, and told him that he would destroy Lebanon if Rafik didn't get out of his way, and if he caused more problems with him. And well, that didn't go over well. And just a few months later, Rafik was assassinated in a horrific attack. He knew he was in danger, so he had a huge convoy that protected him. But they blew him up they put all these explosives in a van and blew it up. Now Hezbollah was directly to blame, but indirectly to blame was Bashar al-Assad. He was the one that was believed to have ultimately given the order to go ahead and do this, and he had just threatened Rafik, so he was the one that most people were looking at. And this caused a severe setback in his relationship with France and the West. He really never totally recovered from this. They looked at him now as a dictator, and this just was very bad for his image. And there was a lot of anger at Syria internationally, so much so that if Bashar was behind this, and I don't think it's ever been completely proven, but if he was, the whole thing backfired because Syrian troops withdrew. They left Lebanon like a month or two later, and it was a total disaster for Bashar al-Assad. A total disaster. And so again, this was a huge setback for Assad's image as this sort of pro-Western person. Huge setback. Well, And so really Chirac at that point was done with. He was basically done with Assad. Didn't even want to talk to him anymore. Uh, but a new president took over in France around 2008, I believe. Nicolas Sarkozy. And Sarkozy, as the years rolled by, he began to sort of change France's attitude towards Syria and tried to bring them back into the fold. I guess that's the best way to say it. He was going to give Bashar al-Assad another chance, and so it incorrectly it got broadcast as a meeting between just Sarkozy and Bashar al-Assad, but actually he just invited Bashar to this sort of Arab summit that they were having in France. There were several other leaders there from Saudi Arabia, all over the place, UAE. And so he invites Bashar al-Assad, and they did have a meeting, and things look to have healed up a little bit. But as it would turn out, there's always these outside events that it's always, by the way, outside events that affect can have an effect on countries. Sometimes everything's fine, and Bashar al-Assad had sort of crushed the opposition. He was a dictator at this point, and he was growing into that role. By the way, he was being seen more in military uniforms. People said he was acting truly like a dictator. He had grown sort of into the role and wasn't sort of pushing, at least behind the scenes, not pushing this reform message. He just didn't. He was growing into the role a little bit more. People said he was looking people in the eyes. He spoke very confidently. Definitely changing. His personality was changing as well. So, and then, of course, these outside events happen that can have such an effect on your country. It's always outside events, usually almost all the time. It's something outside of your own control. And in this case, it was the Arab Spring that occurred. I believe it started in 2011. Of course, it started in sort of North Africa, I believe in Algeria or Tunisia. And then it just spread like wildfire. It spread to Libya, Egypt, all over the place, and of course made its way to Syria. Now, they started out as sort of peaceful protests, and so it was not an armed uprising, but it quickly turned into a armed conflict, as we know now, because Bashar al-Assad moved in to crush it, and whole cities were bombed, attacked, and this led to an armed conflict. And at this point, Syria was never the same. We had a the country became splintered into all these various groups, all competing for control of Syria. You had ISIS, you had the Kurds, you had the Druze, of course you had the Syrian government, you had the Free Syrian Army, and of course the group that eventually was the primary mover in the overthrow of Assad, HTS. You also had Al Qaeda. I mean, all these different players, and so Syria became splintered, and it was clear from as the civil war progressed into 2013, 2014. Assad was starting to lose this war. He was losing ground slowly but surely. Although his army was fighting at that point, they just were losing, and they were. It looked like he was about to be overthrown. And then steps in Russia, Putin. Now, initially, Assad was looking for some help from France and from the U.S., but that just didn't come. So now they were attacking ISIS, of course, but he was losing ground. So Russia comes in, Iran comes in, and Hezbollah comes in, and literally saves Assad. Mainly, the Russians through the air just destroyed Aleppo, which was sort of the heart of the sort of the headquarters for the opposition. That was literally just bombed into oblivion. And on the ground, they were helped by these various militia groups from Hezbollah and some from Iraq that came in and helped and saved basically Bashar al-Assad. But he was increasingly dependent on these foreign entities. He was more and more dependent as his army grew weaker and weaker. And so he saved, and so things sort of the rebels were confined to this very northern area up in the north west called Adib. They were up there, and just this very small area. And basically, Assad did not complete the job. Now, he should have. Now, obviously, Turkey was sort of there, and that was a threat. So that was one of the big reasons he didn't finish them off. But he didn't think they were a threat anymore. So they were up there in this sort of very remote area. But he had taken back Aleppo, Homs, all these areas, and looked like he was basically the victor of the civil war. Things were looking good, and in fact, he was actually starting to be reintegrated into the Arab world. They were starting to coming to the realization that he was going to basically be the leader for a long time to come. So they were inviting him to some events, and things were looking good. And then another event happened that was out of his control. Something outside his country at that point. And that was Hamas launched one of the deadliest attacks in Israel's history against Israel on October 7th, 2023. Thousands of people are killed. Hundreds of Israelis are taken hostage. We don't need to. I think everybody knows what happened. It was a brutal assault, and there was a even bigger response by Israel. Israel goes in and literally flattens Gaza. It's basically a pile of rubble today. Hamas, but the key here, for at least from Syria's point of view, is Hamas has been severely degraded. Severely degraded. Now, I think Bashar probably could have survived that. But what he must have been really worried about and watching with very nervous eyes is that Hezbollah was going to get dragged into this. And initially, Israel and Hezbollah were sort of just trading artillery volleys. It didn't really turn into a full-scale war. But, of course, I think everybody knew that that was not going to be the case for much longer. And so, eventually, of course, Israel launched an invasion into southern Lebanon to basically kick Hezbollah out of those border areas. But more importantly, they launched big assaults on Beirut. We know about that Nasrallah, of course, was assassinated, and most of his entire leadership killed. So Hezbollah is greatly weakened. And then, of course, the now infamous cell phone event and pager event where they Israel blew up their pagers and cell phones. So their communications were completely destroyed. You can't really operate an army without communication. So Hezbollah was severely degraded, took a severe battering. So there was that. So, and of course, this was one of Syria's main supporters at this point. The militias were huge supporters on the ground for Bashar al-Assad. The other, of course, then there was the worry for Assad that Iran was going to get dragged into this. And sure enough, Iran did. After the assassination of Nasrallah, Iran had to respond to that. They did, and they launched an attack against Israel. Israel, of course, responded and attacked with F-35s. They attacked Iran and knocked out almost all of their air defenses and almost all of their missile defenses, or missile batteries. It was a huge hit. Now, rumors are that Iran didn't really talk much about how injured they were, but apparently this was far, far worse than Iran was letting on. They were really hit hard by Israel to the point where they could not even really send any help at this point to Syria. And so that is where we stood until late November. And again, like I said, Bashar al-Assad must have been looking at this with very nervous eyes, looking at this, seeing these events unfold, knowing that his primary methods of support had been severely degraded. And so were the rebels in the north. They were watching this too, HTS. And there was an interesting video that I saw about 6 months ago. Now, of course, foreign media had been completely banned from Syria. They weren't allowed in there, but they were sneaking cameras in. And I saw an interesting video that I watched where they were in Aleppo. And they had, it's probably taken from a mobile phone or something. But they were just driving around Aleppo. And there were no army units. There were no police. There was nothing there. It seemed a little surprising to me. The only thing they said they saw were some military checkpoints on the highways going in and out. But that was pretty much it. And so the rebels certainly had intel that Assad's army was pretty much AWOL. And that's exactly what happened. They launched their attack in late November and just took the city without a fight. And as they moved south, army bases were just abandoned with military equipment. It was clear that through corruption and just a willingness not to fight, they just didn't want to fight, that the Syrian army was done. They were finished. And it was fairly obvious as they were as these rebels were moving down south. There was just no resistance at all. Whole army bases just abandoned with equipment just sitting there. They didn't even take the equipment. I mean, just completely abandoned. So Assad flies to, this was sort of the key moment. Late November, he flies to Russia to try and get support from Putin. And Putin basically allegedly told him, look, we'll fight with you, but we're not going to fight your war for you 100% of the battle. Your army, if it's not going to fight, we're not going to help you. And that was the answer he got. That was it. So Assad comes back, and Homs is I think it's right around the time Homs was in trouble. It was there that some of the groups that were still there, the Iranian and Hezbollah groups, were the only ones that offered some resistance. But once they were defeated, that was completely it for the Syrian army. They didn't even make any showing at all. In fact, there's a story of a Syrian general who was at the base, and he was the only one left. There was nobody, not a single person. And apparently he finally just said, okay, well, that's enough for me. I'm out of here. And so he left. And just amazing. I can't even imagine that. You're a general and your whole army's gone except for you. So Assad, meanwhile, and this is where we really reveal the true nature of his personality and what a coward he really was. He reaped all this destruction on Syria. Hundreds of thousands of people dead, millions of people displaced. And meanwhile, he doesn't tell, he knows he's finished. His goose is cooked, as they say. And so he makes preparations to leave. And this was probably a plan that he had in action for many years. He basically just gets his wife and his kids and gets a plane ready to go. I think he flew to an airbase, Russian airbase, and then from there he was flown to Russia. But here's how devious he really is he told his military commanders that were still listening that, hey, Russia's coming to our defense. Keep fighting. They're going to be here very soon. Meanwhile, he knew that was not at all the case, and that was a complete lie. And he even doesn't even tell his own brother. He doesn't even tell his cousins, all these people that he relied on. Doesn't tell any of them. And then leaves Russia. And that is it. That's the end of the dynasty. He's currently in Russia as far as we know, though there's been no official announcement from him or anything. I believe the Kremlin has tacitly acknowledged this, but that's it. And so that's the end of the Assad dynasty. We have a Syrian country that it's going to be really interesting to see what happens over the next couple of years. Now, Israel has completely wiped out the remaining remnants of the Syrian army, mainly from a hardware perspective. They've taken out the Navy, a lot of their missile and chemical factories, all destroyed. They've seized Mount Hemnon, I believe, or Hernon. I forget the name of it. But it's the tallest peak in the Golan Heights. It's one of the tallest peaks in the region. I think there's one in Lebanon that's a little bit taller, but it oversees Damascus. Perfect view. They could launch artillery from up there. Now, they claim it's only temporary. I tend to doubt that. I don't think they're giving this up anytime soon. Okay, thanks as always for listening.